This week in the field, the pros and cons of long exposure noise reduction. Hi everyone, I'm Scott Davenport. Welcome to In the Field. Thanks for joining me today. If this is your first time checking out one of my videos, thanks for giving me a shot, and hope you like what you see, and you'll subscribe to my channel or follow my Facebook page so you won't miss future videos. I also want to point out that I have workshops coming up for 2018. They're going to open really soon, like in the next 7 to 10 days. So if you're interested, head on over to my website. All the details about upcoming workshops are there. Get yourself on a reserve list, and hopefully I'll see you on a 2018 workshop. So today's topic, long exposure noise reduction. This came to mind quite, I'll say dramatically, when I was out shooting in the field quite recently. It's been maybe 3 or 4 days back as I record this. And I had forgotten about this feature. It had gotten turned on somehow in my camera, and it was, well, very immediately noticeable that I had this feature turned on. Let me show you the footage from this shoot, and then I'm going to come back and explain, well, what is this noise reduction feature that's in our cameras, and what are the benefits, and what are the drawbacks? I'm standing up on the bluffs over Scripps Pier, and I'm trying to start something new today, a new little project where I love the ocean so much. I love coming down here, but I want to do something different compositionally, and try to do more minimal compositions and make the shot about one single thing. And so I thought I'd start off easy and come to Scripps Pier. Here is a very obvious, very strong subject. I want to make everything else just be minimal. And so probably talking long exposures, who knows how long. And I'm gonna get down on the beach there, find a good vantage on the pier. And of course, the secondary part of me is gonna be watching the sky, because right now, this is very promising. This could end up being an incredible sunset. So of course, if the sun comes out and lights up these clouds at the horizon there, I will be taking plenty of photos of my more traditional fare. Trying out my first composition. I mean, it is gorgeous. I took just a quick frame of this because in and of itself, it's beautiful. But, doing my long exposure thing. So set up, I've got the filter system on the front. I'm using a 10 and a 6 stops, so 16 stops of light. And this will be somewhere in the neighborhood of a 6 to 7 minute exposure. So everything else is gonna smooth out. And what will remain is, the strict, strong pier. That's not going to move. Everything else is gonna be soft, and that's kind of my idea here, is to smooth everything else out around it, but the pier itself will be the very strong subject. Something that's proving a challenge is, of course, the variability of the sun. So it's just peeked through another set of clouds. I'm still about halfway into my exposure here, and I'm gonna just have to kind of take a couple of guesses as to how long that sun's gonna be strong in the frame, and just stop the exposure ahead of time. So it'll be a few tries at this, I'm sure, and perhaps as the sun gets lower, this will become easier to meter and easier to predict how long to shoot for. So I've apparently mistakenly left long exposure noise reduction turned on in this camera, or somewhere along the line accidentally flipped it on, and I'm waiting another 6 to 7 minutes for the camera to think about noise. All right, so from that footage, you can kind of already guess what one of the drawbacks is, but let's take a step back and talk about what is long exposure noise reduction. So when we do a long exposure, and most of our cameras these days will consider anything above 1 second long. So if you have this feature turned on for above 1 second exposure, it's going to kick in and start doing things. So we have the camera exposing for the scene for a long time, and the sensor will heat up as it's working and collecting all this light. And what can happen is we end up with hotspots on the sensor, and those can show up as small, like pixelated colors, like a red or a green or so forth on our photos. And that is noise that results from sensor heat. This is different than your luminance noise or your color noise. We still deal with those in post-processing tools. But this is specifically about sensor noise. I thought the easiest way for me to show you what this looks like is to see an example. So I have on this screen here, this is a photo I took when I had the feature turned on. So that big, I was doing a 6 minute exposure. This thing's, really long. And when I zoom in, I'm going to zoom in up to the upper corner here, and I'm going to turn on the visualize spots feature in the dust overlay. And so we can say, okay, I got a couple of sensor spots. There's a normal grain pattern that happens when we crank this, when we crank this slider up really far. But there's no particular hot spots. There's like maybe one here, one there. Typical sensor dust, right? So this looks pretty normal for this type of view on a photo. Now, let me go to the second photo. I turned off the long exposure noise reduction in the camera. Still have a long exposure, right? This is still in the same area, 6 minutes or so. Let's zoom in and I'll turn on that visualize spot with the A key. Notice all these little white dots. And I still have my 2 sensor spots, but now all these other little guys are showing up. Well, I don't know how much this is going to translate to the video. I'll zoom the video in, but right in this area here, again, one more time. See this spot right there? It is a red colored pixel. That is noise from sensor heat. So we saw in the shot where noise reduction was turned on in our camera, that didn't show up. Turn it off, it did show up. So now turning it on and off is simple. It usually is a menu in your camera, and different cameras have different menu systems, but you'll find something called like long exposure noise reduction, long exposure NR. Sometimes it's abbreviated as LENR, long exposure noise reduction. And it's got a toggle on or off. And maybe you have a control to say how long of an exposure you consider to be worthy of turning this feature on. So the pros, the benefits, obviously, are that you reduce noise and you don't have these, colored pixels that show up in your images. Now, that positive may not always be true, and I say that because on the Sony camera that I'm using, A7R, the RAW file gets this information included in it. And so the RAW file that comes out of the camera has taken into account the hot spots by having this long exposure noise reduction feature turned on, and I don't see them in the RAW file. My older camera, I had a Nikon D7000, some older cameras before then, they had the feature, but I needed to use the vendor-specific software in order to get the benefit. And that really broke my workflow, bringing things into, I think it was Aperture before, now Lightroom. Adding a third tool in, it didn't work very well. And usually, sad to say, the vendor software that comes with your camera, it's just not usually very good. It's functional, but usually not very usable, not user-friendly. So check your camera, and one easy way to do it is test it, try it out. But if you're not seeing that your RAW file is coming into Lightroom or ON1 or Luminar or Capture One or whatever you're using to manage your assets, if they're not getting the benefit, well then the one major benefit of long exposure noise reduction is lost to you. Now, the drawbacks. It takes twice as long to get a photo. As you saw in the footage there, I was doing a 6-minute exposure, and when I had long exposure noise reduction left on, the camera is now going to take an additional 6 minutes to leave the sensor active and start measuring the various hot spots on the sensor so it can figure out where all those little hot spots are and try to correct those in the RAW file that it writes out. So if you're doing 1 second, 2 second exposures, okay, that's not terrible. But if you're doing 4-minute exposures, 6-minute exposures, and so on and so forth, and you're shooting at golden hour, you're eating up a lot of time. And we, landscape photographers, we don't have a lot of time when the light gets really good. So you have to compare, the drawback of having to spend some time in post-processing, retouching away these little dots, versus how much time can I invest when I'm in the field to let the camera do some of that work for me. Most of the time, 99% of the time, I turn the feature off because the time in the field is more valuable to me. The light is only good for so long, and I can invest a few more minutes in Lightroom if I need to. And it's pretty easy to see those spots. We just turn on this visualize spots, and I can see that there. And yeah, I got to go start clicking around and spend, however much time here. So I'd have to do that. That screen, not too much going on down here. There's some in the water. This is reflections in the ocean. So there's some work that I'm going to have to do to clean them up. But if that means getting twice as many photos while I'm out in the field, that's good to me. So that's my take on this feature. If you're doing shots during the day, where you're just doing a long exposure because you feel like it, or the clouds are moving along really cool, and then you can turn this on because you're not pressed for time as far as golden light. So the tip of the week, long exposure noise reduction. For me, it's turn it off, but certainly check it. I think the big tip is check your camera after you've had it serviced. I was trying to think of why did this feature get turned on in my camera. I was surprised by this when I was out shooting, and I realized I'd sent the camera in to be serviced for an unrelated problem, and some of the firmware settings came back that were different. That's a different story, and I'm not particularly happy about the fact my firmware settings got changed, but I missed this one, and so it thankfully didn't cost me too much in the field, because when you're shooting anything over 30 seconds, it becomes painfully obvious, oh, this is on, and the camera's taking longer than it should to do something. So check your settings once you've had your camera cleaned or serviced or whatnot to make sure that this thing didn't get turned on unless you wanted it to be turned on. And that'll do it for this week in the field. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you did, let me know somehow. Comments on the video are great. Social shares are always appreciated. Questions are awesome. Keep sending them in, and I will usually turn around and answer in a couple of days. Speaking of questions, a couple of emails that I get, I'm not able to respond to. So double check that either your email address is accurate, or for whatever reason I'll get email bounces, and I feel bad about that because I'm really trying to answer your question, but I have no other way of getting a hold of you. So if you've sent me a question in an email and you haven't gotten an answer, try a comment on the video, and then I can answer in the comments. And that way, typically our web browsers don't suffer from some of the trials and tribulations of email systems. With that, until next time, my name is Scott Davenport, and happy shooting. Comments on the video below. Are they always below? I never know if the comments are always below or not. Most of the time they're below. Maybe I shouldn't say below.